Pope Gregory the First. And this is the first pope, I think, that I've mentioned in this class yet. And it's kind of surprising because today in modern life, we think of popes as being so important, although they were even more important in medieval times. The word pope comes from papas, which is papa. So when we're referring to people as the Pope, we're referring to him as Daddy. But where did the popes come from? Why? How did they get to be important? It's sort of lost in the mist of history. But I think one of the reasons that we can claim is that, as I've been pointing out in the lecture, though there continued to be a single centralized government in the East, what used to be the eastern half of the Roman Empire, there wasn't really any single centralized government that even laid claim to ruling over the whole West. And there were people who thought that should happen. Also, as this sign points out, the East had a leader, beginning with Constantine, who was a leader of the government, as we would understand it today, and also at least a sponsor and a coordinator of church activities in the East. And because we don't have such a centralized ruler in the East, people were beginning to think, well, maybe we can find a centralized religious leader in the West who can fulfill the same functions in the West that the Roman emperor used to do, and that Constantine and his Byzantine successors were able to do in the Eastern Empire. So the idea of the Pope as being that person begins to arise. How does it start out? Well, I mentioned beforehand that there were these people called bishops who were sort of the local leaders of local churches. Each local church had a bishop who was in charge. And like all of the other big cities and small cities in Europe, East and West, there had been a bishop of Rome. To begin with, he doesn't seem to have been more important than a lot of the other bishops, except in that Rome was more important. By the 500s, Rome was in pretty sorry shape. It wasn't a very well-functioning city, and at one time it had almost become a ghost town, but it had all of this lore and tradition attached to it because of the 1,000-year reign of the empire, and or rather the Roman country. The empire had not lasted for quite 1,000 years. So the Bishop of Rome had a certain authority. They try to put this into a kind of legal context by saying that they use something called a Petrine doctrine. And by means of the Petrine doctrine, they try to say that really the Bishop of Rome is the one who has control of the church and over all the other bishops. And the way they argue this is that they say St. Peter had been the first bishop of Rome. That's sort of traditionally understood. We don't really have a lot of proof. This is why the big cathedral in the Vatican is called St. Peter's, because Peter was the first bishop of Rome. And it says in the Bible that during the time that Jesus was still on earth and Peter was one of his disciples, Jesus said to Peter, "What is your name?" And of course he knew what Peter's name was. And Peter says, "Peter," or Petrus, which in Greek means rock. And Jesus says, "That's right, you're named Petrus, and on this rock I will build my church." So they use the story to suggest that because Jesus had said this to St. Peter, and because St. Peter went on to become the Bishop of Rome, then the Bishop of Rome should be the rock on which Jesus had intended to build his church. And in other words, the Bishop of Rome should be the one to have authority over all of the other bishops. And over all of Europe was the idea, except that it was going to be rather hard for any one pope to assert the authority of the Christian church based in Rome over all of what had formerly been the western half of the Roman Empire. Various reasons. For one thing, many Europeans are still pagans. Not everybody has even converted to Christianity yet. The Franks, who move west from what today we would call Germany to occupy the territory that we now call France, hence the Franks become the French, and the Anglo-Saxons, who also start out in northern Germany, but who go across the English Channel and become the English, basically. You sometimes hear English people referred to as Anglo-Saxons, as in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, WASP. They were pagan. Also, there were a lot of groups in Europe, Western Europe, who were still following this idea of Arianism, the idea that God and Jesus were of different substances, that God had somehow created Jesus, and that therefore God and Jesus were not two aspects of the same thing. And apart from the theological disagreement, one problem is that the Arian churches didn't really recognize any kind of central authority. They were just, out there in the countryside. And they, in fact, resisted the idea of being organized under a single centralized government. A third problem was that in Ireland had actually been converted to Christianity fairly early. Some missionaries had gone up there, including a guy named St. Patrick, which is why St. Patrick's Day is the big Irish holiday, because it's the saint's day of the guy who converted Ireland to Christianity. But the Irish had come up with a system all their own, which was based on monasteries. The abbots of monasteries were the ones who had governmental power over the churches, rather than the bishops who had governmental power in the other parts of Europe. And they too, the monasteries, as I pointed out when I was talking about monasticism, were independent, not only of the church in Rome, but pretty much of each other. So any pope that was going to try and come up with a way of unifying Europe under a single pope would have his work cut out for him. And Gregory, whom I began by talking about, the Gregory the First, who was really the first important pope that we know a lot about, decided to undertake that mission. He was a very interesting guy in a lot of ways. He sponsored missionaries to various parts of Europe to try and first convince the pagans to become Christians, and second, convince the people who were already Christian, but not the same kind of Christianity that they had in Rome, to be the same kind of Christianity that they had in Rome, so that the Pope in Rome would be the one controlling head of all Christians. There wouldn't be a whole lot of varieties of Christians, some of which recognized Rome and some of which did not. They would all be recognizing Gregory the First, Pope of Rome, as their spiritual leader, and hopefully as a kind of unifying force that would bring Western Europe together the same way that the Roman emperors had brought empire together before the fall of the Roman Empire. And it was not easy to do, because there wasn't really any one way that you could convert pagans to Christianity. One of the things that you see happening in the West, not so much in the East, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is that Christianity finds itself adapting to various circumstances. If you go to the country of Poland today, you will find that a lot of Catholics pay a lot of attention to the Virgin Mary, much more so than we do, for instance, in the churches in the United States. If you go into churches, there are big pictures of the Virgin Mary. There's, in fact, the most sacred Christian shrine in Poland is in the city of Częstochowa, where there is a big, big church, I've been there, which has as its focal point a portrait of the Virgin Mary, supposedly painted by St. Luke. And you have to wonder, why are they paying so much attention to the Virgin? My suspicion is that back before the Christians arrived, the Poles were worshiping a religion that focused on a goddess, focused on a female head of the religion. And when the Christians came, they said, we've got Jesus. And the Poles said, don't you have some woman we can worship? And so the Christians come up with, you can worship the Virgin Mary if you want to. So there are various ways in which they have to adapt to the preferences and the inclinations. And it's a kind of interesting balancing act because, of course, they don't want to adapt Christianity so much in order to make it appealing to the pagans that it stops really being Christianity. And one of the interesting documents or series of documents that we have has to do with the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, which, as you may remember, were pagans. But the Anglo-Saxons are getting pushed from two directions to become Christian. First, the Irish monks, who represent one kind of Christianity, are coming down from the north. Also, Pope Gregory has sent up from Europe Augustine of Kent. You remember my telling you that when I mentioned Augustine of Hippo, there would be another Augustine that we would be working with later on, and this is the guy. So Augustine of Kent is coming up from the Roman church, basically, the church based in Rome that Gregory's in charge of. And they're kind of each trying to convince the Anglo-Saxons to come over to their side. And fortunately, we have several letters that go back and forth between Augustine and Pope Gregory, and they're very interesting. Augustine writes back, he says, I've got some Anglo-Saxons who are coming to my church now, but they are saying that their wives are not going to come to church when their wives are having their period, when they're menstruating. And we're trying to tell them that really has nothing to do with it. In the Christian church, you can go into a church even when you're having your period. Should we try and push them on this? And Gregory writes back a very interesting letter. He says, you got to be careful about these people. You can't pull them along too fast. So kind of go step by step until you get them where you need for them to be. Well, after both Augustine and Gregory are gone, after they die, the conflict between the Irish type of Christianity coming from the north and the Roman type of Christianity coming from the south is continuing and is resolved eventually in a meeting called the Synod of Whitby in 664. And this has to do with a guy named King Oswy of Northumbria, which is a country in the middle of the island that is now England and Scotland. King Oswy is an Irish Christian, and his wife is a Roman Christian. So you've got these divisions even in between the families. And the synod is called to discuss, among other issues, when are we going to celebrate Easter? Because the Irish monks celebrate Easter at a different time of the year than the Romans do. And this seems like a fairly trivial point, but in fact, if you've got two different parts of the church celebrating Easter at two different times, are they going to be sticking together on other issues? So you've got to bring everybody together under the same set of rules. And in the middle of the discussion, the representatives from Rome are saying, well, I'm coming here from the Pope, and the Pope is the successor to St. Peter, who was the first bishop of Rome. And King Oswy turns to his Irish supporters and says, really? And the Irish supporters say, oh, well, yeah, St. Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and that's why the Pope is the head of the church down south. And Oswy gives in and says, okay, we'll do things the way they do them down south. And although that's not the only event that determines the future of the Christian church in England or in Great Britain, it is an example of how, in many ways, different parts of Europe are coming together because Pope Gregory, almost might say King Gregory, Pope Gregory is pulling people together under the same form of Christianity. Okay, I'll stop this tape and start another one.